Hi, I'm Terry Gulick, and I've been a longtime friend of the Coolidge family, having met them for the first time in August of 1945, right a few days after the end of the Great World War, the Second World War. And my father came home announcing that I'm taking next week off, and we're going to tour Vermont. And our first stop is Plymouth, and I thought, what do we want to go to Plymouth for? Well, there's friends of ours that are coming up from Connecticut. They haven't been up in a while because gas rationing had been dropped so we could travel wherever we wanted to once again after a few years of restriction. We arrived, and that's when I met Mr. and Mrs. John Coolidge, Florence Trumbull Coolidge, John's wife and mother of the two daughters, Cynthia and Lydia, who were approximately my age. And we visited in the back of the homestead and part of the addition that the president had put on after he retired. And I remember sitting down and playing the piano that I had been taking piano lessons for, and impressing the girls how I played piano. And we visited for a while, and then we took off. Well, I was asked by one member of the family how we ever got to know the Coolidges. And the background is that my father worked for a company that produced heavy cotton canvas duct, which had a feature of being fireproofed with a chemical that was a retardant. Meanwhile, there had been a horrific fire, if I remember correctly, on a train somewhere in Connecticut, and it was covered with canvas. It was very flammable. Well, apparently the powers that be of that railroad company learned about my father's company and wanted to meet with a representative, and so Dad arranged for a meeting. And when he got there, he found out he was meeting John Coolidge, who represented the railroad at the time before he eventually went into business himself. And so they hit it off. And I remember Dad saying, I met John Coolidge, private citizen, knowing and had learned that John really was not comfortable being in the public limelight when his father was president. John, having spent the last year or two at Mercersburg Academy in Pennsylvania, and then all 4 years of his college year at Amherst College, where his father had gone. And of course that meant he had to have a Secret Service man 24/7. But he did survive being the president's second and only then surviving son, and went on to have his own private life. But I was taught very quickly, don't ask any questions about being in the White House. If John says something involuntarily, okay, fine, but I learned very quickly that he was just John Coolidge. And when he came to Plymouth, you didn't call him Mr. Coolidge, you referred to him as John. That's the way he wanted it, because that's the way everybody called everybody by their first name up here. But anyway, we got acquainted, and so we visited from time to time. Usually we ended up bringing a picnic lunch up here when the Coolidges were in residence at the homestead. And I guess my mother loved to cook and prepare food. I don't think Mrs. Coolidge was quite as enthusiastic about that part of life. Anyway, we came up and sat outside, and 1957, I believe, or no, 1956, we came up Labor Day weekend because the Coolidges were going to be leaving to go back home to Connecticut, and had picnic lunch. And I remembered Mr. Coolidge saying, or John, I should say, that I ought to tell you we've got some plans for the house here. And with that, he said, we're arranging to turn the house over to the state of Vermont, with the understanding they will detach the addition that my father put on and move it over to the knoll where it sits today. And that was fine. But then Dad said, well, what's going to happen to Aurora? Oh, John kind of chuckled and said, kind of interesting. He said, I thought I better tell her right firsthand before it got around through the grapevine. Well, I went in the kitchen where she always stayed, and said I had something to tell you, and sat down. Said, started to tell her about the plans of turning the house over to the state. Before I could go any further, he said, "Are you going to do that, John? I got to go get another job." Now, Aurora was 86 at the time. Anyways, all John could do to keep from laughing. But anyway, because Aurora never had a sense of humor. She was very serious. So anyway, no, you don't have to go get another job. One of the arrangements is that you stay here, run the house the way you always have. Just the only difference is state becomes the owner and I'm no longer owner. So that was understood. And I think it was about a year later that Aurora did pass on, and then the state took over and redesigned the house with walkways that you find when you go through the homestead. I remember the first time I went through after that happened, I was kind of gulping how things had changed from what I remember them originally. But anyway, it's a good thing, because otherwise the rooms, if they hadn't went through the rooms, it'd be a wreck by now. So anyway, that's how that all happened, and we kept in touch. And Lydia and I went out together a few times until we went our separate ways. I ended up in the Army, and meanwhile she met her husband and got married. But always sort of favored Lydia as a good friend rather than her sister, who was a different personality. And Lydia and I were always on the same wavelength of life and the living of it. Anyway, fast forward to 1959. I was working for the Cooperative Extension Service in 4-H, and I had an assignment that I was not very happy with. One early November day, into the driveway down in Springfield, where I live, comes John Coolidge. And I knew it was him because he had the Connecticut license plate with number 62 on it. I thought, what the heck is he coming in about? Anyway, he got out of the car, and I said hello, and he came over and said, I'm getting set to rehabilitate and open up the cheese plant up in Plymouth. How would you like to go to work for me? So that got me out of the extension service, and I went to work for John and helped make cheese. And I wanted to expand and do other things. I was a young fellow then, if you can believe it. And however, he said, no, I'm just happy doing what we're doing. And it got boring. So I told him, I said, I've got to move on. And I did. But our friendship stayed over the years. And I remember the last time I saw John was after my folks had passed on. He had moved up here with his daughter, Lydia, and her husband, who had retired. And so I went to visit him, which turned out to be the last visit I ever made with him, having died shortly after. But I said, so you're enjoying being up here, John? Yes, and I don't need to be moved or move anywhere until they take me to the cemetery. Typical Coolidge humor. There's another story. When they came down to visit us one time in Springfield and had dinner, there had been a serious story that came out of West Rupert, Vermont, which some of you may know is on the western border next to New York State, down in Bennington County. And so Dad said, John, you know everything about Vermont. Where's West Rupert? Long pause. Well, Charlie, I think it's west of Rupert. And my father said, John, your father would be proud of you with that answer. And John chuckled a little. Anyway, people ask if I knew the president. I said no, because he died 14 months before I was born. I was born in 1934. He died January 5th, 1933, of a heart attack. But sadly, there's a lot of tragedy in that family. And the two daughters died young. I don't think Cynthia was even 60 years old when she died of cancer. Lydia lived 6 months longer than her grandfather. She died at the age of 61 of cancer. Still a very young age in this day and age, but anyway. But I feel very fortunate that I know all 3 great-grandchildren and all 6 of the great-great-grandchildren, some of whom have grown up and flown the coop. One of whom is hoping to get to be a professional baseball player. Whether I'll be around to see that happen or not, I don't know. Well, that's about a synopsis of our relationship with the family. I think the key was that Dad met John first as just private citizen John Coolidge and didn't make anything of him. And John liked that. Got very comfortable with Dad immediately. Yeah. And I think of presidents and their families, the Obama daughters, for instance, how did they handle being in the White House? And because you just can't live like all other children growing up if you're in that particular situation. I realized I would never want to be in that situation myself. Anyway, that's the story on the Coolidge-Gulick relationship.